No, I think the three-point shot is a incredible invention, and I'm speaking both as a fan, as an analyst, and somebody who's made money based on how successful the league is. And there's no question in my mind the decision to put a three-point stripe down on the court in 1979 made pro basketball better.
He is a New York Times bestselling author, along with being a professor at the University of Texas. And his upcoming book, Hoop Atlas, is coming out May 7th and should be available at your local bookstores at the record of this podcast. We welcome Kirk Goldsberry onto Hoopsology. Welcome, Kirk.
What's up, Justin and Matt? How are you guys?
Doing pretty well. And thank you for coming out to the show. I think I can speak for Matt. Ever since we relaunched our podcast in 2020, you've been on our list to have on the show. So it's a pleasure having you on here.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying so. It's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So let's hop into it. Your latest book, Hoop Atlas, kind of bridges the gap of the evolution of the pro game in terms of the Michael Jordan era into now. And this is kind of a general question when you're doing all this research in terms of compiling all this data about the different trends within the modern game of the NBA. What really surprised you about compiling, looking at the data?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's the book is about exactly what you just said, the metamorphosis of the league I study the most and watch the most and have been a fan of since I was a kid. And as a data analyst, it's been sort of my job for over 10 years to study these trends, the data behind them, and understand what's next, either as an analyst at ESPN or the vice president of the Spurs or whatever. I always had to know where this thing was going. But like anything in life, analytically, you can't know where something is going unless you really understand where it's been and where it is. And so that's led me on a quest to understand the NBA and what I would call the modern NBA since Michael Jordan. And obviously, I think the definitive trend in the post Jordan NBA sort of remains this perimeter awakening. Um, um, the just giant explosion in perimeter skill and sort of the league turning itself inside out. And my first book, Sprawl Ball, really looks at that from how analytics and three-point shooting reshaped the league. This book comes at it from a different angle and looks at like the most influential superstars and how they've invented the modern NBA on the hardwood itself. So giving credit to them almost like they're artists or musicians, changing the genre.
So we've had multiple journalists on our show, and I think their opinion of specifically the 3-point shot. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matt. I think it's generational. I think some of our younger journalists they seem to lean towards the 3-point shot being a positive. Some of the older veteran journalists seem to think that the 3-point shot has kind of affected the game very negatively. When you're looking at the data, where do you lie within that? Is there a definitive opinion of whether or not specifically the 3-point shot has harmed the NBA in this day and age, you think?
No, I think the three-point shot is a incredible invention, and I'm speaking both as a fan, as an analyst, and somebody who's made money based on how successful the league is. And there's no question in my mind the decision to put a three-point stripe down on the court in 1979 made pro basketball better. It made women's basketball better. It made men's college basketball. It opened up the game. Where I sort of say, here's the provocative point, Justin, I would say, what are the chances the right place for that line in 1975 is the exact same, or 1979 is the exact same place it should be in
Wow,
2025?
great
You know,
point.
every other league has moved their line back in the 21st century. You want to talk about FIBA, you want to talk about men's college hoops, you want to talk about the W, you want to talk about women's college hoops. They've all moved, except for the one with the best shooters on the planet, except for the one that's been affected the most by the shot. And so that's where I really challenge my friends at the league office and have some really provocative discussions with players and coaches and podcast hosts. Why can't we move this thing? Everybody else has done it. So that's where I come down. But yeah, I think definitively it's been a massive success. Uh, Basketball without the 3-point shot is less fun to me. Period. Somebody can have a different opinion. That's fine. But if you're asking me personally, from a business and an analytics perspective, and just as a fan perspective, I think it's a massive success.
Kirk, if you would take us back to the early days of the 3-point shot, it seems to be my perception that it's, and granted, my viewership of basketball started in the early 90s, so the 3-point shot was well established. Was it mostly a desperation type of shot at that point when it came into fruition and introduction into the league?
I remember one of my favorite stats in Sprawl Ball was, I think so. I wrote Sprawl Ball 2017, 18, around that time, 2018. And the stat was, for the first time it was true. I think, there were more made threes in the 2017-18 season than the entire 1980s as a decade. So
I believe
just to
that.
give you an idea, no matter how you slice it, Matt, the answer to your question sort of starts with this headline. Dudes didn't shoot this in the 80s. When the line was first down, it was used in desperation situations for sure. There were a few specialists in the 80s that could knock it down. In the 90s, a few more. But ultimately, because the players were never sort of developed to shoot from 24 feet ever, why would you do that, dude? Unless you're Pete Maravich, or one of these other crazy successful jump shooters of that prehistoric era. But there was no plays designed for that, and there was no drills designed for that in high school basketball. When Michael Jordan made a shot to win the 1984 championship in the NCAA tournament, there was no 3-point line on that court. Um, so even some of the guys we credit with inventing the modern NBA, Jordan himself played a big chunk of their basketball without the shot at all. So why would they have developed it? And so when people say, "Oh, Michael couldn't shoot threes," he never even shot one until he was done at UNC or whatever. So why would he be good at this? And then his first call, Doug Collins played a very successful career without it and learned to coach without it. And so it took a long time for it to get to where it is now. But it's almost like this thing was just plopped down. And what would you expect these guys in mid-career to do with it? It was almost like a gimmick, I think, originally.
Yeah, trying to think, of like the first team to really be like a big threat from 3-point range, and I've Chris Mullin of the Warriors comes to mind, Reggie
Yeah.
Miller on the Pacers. Can you did you find in your research any of kind of the earliest prototype examples of a team that really had, I guess, a significant threat other teams would game plan for from the 3-point line?
Well, I think you mentioned it. I think Reggie Miller was the first superstar to really
Mm.
leverage the shot uh, in the 90s, and people like, oh my God, you can do that. Obviously, Larry Bird, when he won the 3-point contests, I think he won the first three of them. Really, sort of, you know, put the shot on the map for superstars. But even Larry, I think the most he ever averaged in a game was 3.3 attempts per game. And now it's not uncommon for in Boston, I write in Hoop Atlas, Jason Tatum is shooting 9 a game, and so it's just we're triple what Larry was doing, and people of a certain age are like, oh yeah, Larry Bird's one of the greatest shooters of all time. He barely touched the shot compared to even today's like mediocre 3-point shooters. The team that I really write about in Hoop Atlas, though, Matt, is the early aught Spurs. You have to remember when Shaq and Kobe won 3 in a row and looked like the best team of the young century. The Spurs, even though they had Duncan and Robinson, needed something else. And here comes Bruce Bowen in the 2003 playoffs, game 2 of the Western Conference semifinals. He hit 6 corner threes. And I argue that that's sort of a seminal moment. They won that series. Bruce had 27 points in that game. They blew out the Lakers, who were 3-time defending champions. Bruce had 27, Shaq had 27, and Kobe had 27. But 18 of Bruce's 27 were on corner threes. And I think that was when that Spurs team recognized the power of the three-point shot and spacing to get dudes away from Tim on the left block and punish them for doubling. And that was the team I associate with really valuing the shot. But interestingly, Matt, that valuing of the shot started on defense. The Spurs dynasty is defensive, and their love affair with the corner three actually started as a sort of a fear of the corner three and changing their defensive rotations on defense. So they would very rarely give it up. And you can look at the numbers. They gave up the fewest corner threes of the 2000s by far. And then they learned, other teams sort of are vulnerable here. And if we get Bruce Bowen, and if we get players like Brent Barry, Robert Ory, and we sort of space the floor around Tim, man, either Tim's going to have a nice day or one of these shooters. They can't defend it both. And that to me is like the first really modern offense. That's like you either have to put all your apples against Tim or our interior threat, or you have to protect against these shooters on the edge. And obviously Manu and Tony were incredible playmakers. But those that would be my long answer to your question on both sides of the court, or the early 2000 Spurs.
You mentioned in the book also about Allen Iverson, and he has popped up through our podcast, and I think he's very underrated. I noticed with a lot of this younger players, his influence, I think a lot of modern players in the NBA and his fans, the relationship with AI is much more unique compared to Kobe or Jordan or even LeBron. And you said in the book that his legacy is complicated. Can you expand upon that in terms of, obviously he has his, different off the court struggles and what he had to go through, but specifically on the court, what did you notice with Allen Iverson specifically about his legacy?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, Allen is one of my favorite players I've ever seen in person. When I say his legacy is complicated, I stay away from the really complicated cultural stuff. That's not how I write about the NBA.
Sure.
But he inspired me really to write this book in a way, because in this sort of dumb banner counting, ring counting discourse that we have, true influence on the sport is going unnoticed or disrespected. And like you said, and I write this in Hoop Atlas, it's like if you ask James Harden or Stephen Curry or Kyrie Irving about Allen Iverson, you don't get a lot of hemming and hawing. To them, his legacy isn't complicated. He is one of the greats, one of the most influential players of the modern era. And I'll tell you why. I mean, what he did, and it ties into his style legacy too off the court, but his style on the court, his handles specifically, his ability as an undersized perimeter player to use unprecedented perimeter skill to get buckets and look cool doing it, really foreshadowed, I think, the Kyries or the Stephen Curry. And we write a lot about Stephen, and the most underrated part of his game is his handles. And I think if you ask those dudes where they were inspired, it's the crossovers. It's the Ty Lue of the 2001 finals, the step over after the crossover. And it's the cross up of Michael Jordan in his rookie year, which is a big scene in Hoop Atlas. And really, Justin, I think one of the big points of this book is we can do better celebrating greatness in basketball if we look at that kind of greatness, if we look at the influence on who actually challenged basketball to be different as they were winning scoring titles, or as their teams were, or they were going to the All-Star game. And that's like how music or art appreciation works, right? Nobody talks about Miles Davis, how many records he sold or whatever. And I say the same thing about Iverson. Yes, no shit, he doesn't have rings. Sorry if I can't swear. But like,
you're good.
Everybody watched those highlights. Like before Iverson, there were no viral dribbling highlights, maybe a few God Sham God things or some Pete Maravich things. And I don't want to disrespect those, but obviously Allen took it to another level. And when you watch Chris Paul or when you watch Stephen Curry, you can see that impact. And so the big central argument in the book is like, the real legacies in the NBA aren't up in the rafters in those banners. They're down on the floor, game in and game out. And Iverson may not have won as many rings as Tim Duncan, who's my favorite player of that era, but undeniably he influenced today's games more. Like he
Yeah.
influenced to like Tim. Nobody plays like Tim anymore, you know. And he was the best player of his era, in my opinion. I'll argue about that with anybody, but you know, I think Allen has a longer lasting sort of artistic influence on the sport.
So, do you think in this era of media specifically, because I agree with you, a lot of the discourse among kind of the mainstream media on television is, ring counting, kind of hot takes. But I notice now, even with the podcast with JJ Redick and LeBron, Draymond Green, getting a lot of different player perspective. Do you think that discourse is going to change in terms of talking about basketball in more of a appreciation type of way compared to kind of this hot take era we've been in for such a long time?
Yeah, let's hope so. And those are great projects. And I think JJ has done a great job. Obviously, LeBron is one of the more gifted sort of basketball IQ people of our generation. So to hear his thoughts, but I guarantee you, because when you talk to players, you get this. You go, another player that is, I think, had an outsized impact that we write a lot of books about in this book, Hoop Atlas, is Manu Ginobili. The Euro step has changed the sport. And when Manu retired, LeBron himself tweeted, congrats on your career and thank you for the swaggiest move in the league right now, which is the Euro step. And so I think LeBron is a basketball historian. He's a savant. And, I hope this version of recognizing greatness, not just ring counting and banner counting, but looking at things like the Euro step or handles or step back threes, becomes at least a companion to these other forms of trying to quantify or rank players. Because as I said, in other sort of artistic forums, they don't just count record sales. Like we don't look at the most influential musicians of all time and be like, oh, they sold the most records. And often those things aren't in harmony, right? Like the most impactful musicians or artists or filmmakers don't make blockbuster movies or or have the most streams on Spotify. Those are different artists entirely. So I think it's interesting to me, but LeBron's already there, and the Manu example I think proves it that the players have a chance to be like, yeah, let's really talk about greatness in a different way. Because let's be honest, winning an NBA championship is very, very hard, and many of the game's best players have never done it, in part because of sort of ecological situations beyond their control.
Absolutely. So well said. And this idea of influence around the game, I find to be so fascinating. And particularly now in the modern era where the game has gone very global, as we've seen, very, very heavily entrenched with this sort of American identity, back in the 90s and maybe before, even though the rest of the world was playing some. Um, how do you see the influence looking at the modern era right now? Like, do you think there may be, given our last, I believe, 6 MVPs are not American born players, which is a testament to how the game has grown? Do you think influence will be felt, maybe like when you look at Jokic, let's say, great player, no doubt, very efficient player. Do you think the level of influence may not be felt as much in America, but more so globally? Or how do you see that influence being felt for these elite level players?
It's interesting. And in the book, Matt, one of the giant titans, of course, Atlas was a titan. And so that's the pun the book uses for its title, Hoop Atlas. But David Stern sort of carried pro basketball into a different realm, along with Michael Jordan in the 80s and 90s. But one of his big things, obviously, was opening up the NBA to international influence and being very intentional about how he sought to globalize the best basketball league in the world. And I think the stat you cited is phenomenal. an American hasn't won an MVP this decade. And I'll go one step
Yeah,
further. There's a path where they don't get one. So I
true.
think Akeem, Steve Nash, maybe I'm missing one other. I think in the history of the NBA before 2020, there's 2 or 3 international MVPs. I have it in the book. I just forget the research. But we could see an entire decade where we see no Americans. And I think that's a testament to how great the sport is. I think that's a testament to how effective David Stern's vision and implementation of that vision was. But it's also made the game so great. We talked about Manu a second ago. You talk about what Jokic, Antetokounmpo, and Embiid have done for the big position, and classic European big influence going back to old school bigs. Whether you're talking about Tony Kukoc or you're talking about um, Rick Smits or Vlade Divac or Marcelonis or whoever you want to talk about, the passing, the playmaking big is one of the big imports of European basketball. And none of this is all looking like it's coming to a head in the presence of Victor Wembanyama right now,
Yeah.
which is like, I'm 7'4", but I can get 7 assists tonight. I can do step back threes, and I can still dunk on your head and get 17 rebounds. And I think one of the more provocative ideas is that the European influences showed us that big players could do everything, and that might be bad news for little players. And you can see this in American young players too. Chet Holmgren comes to mind. Cooper Flagg, who we haven't even seen play pro hoops yet. If you're 6'10" right now, you're learning to shoot and pass and dribble. And you have people like Dirk to thank for that. Tony Kukoc, undeniably, international big men have done that better than American big men. And that's, coincidence or not, those 3 MVPs you just named are European dudes who can beat you from the perimeter. Giannis has one of the best Euro steps I've ever seen. And obviously Jokic can pass and shoot, and Embiid can dribble and shoot. And I think it's one of the more interesting trends in the book. But I think it's bad news for smaller players if I had to sort of get a crystal ball out, Matt.
Can you expand upon that? What do you mean by bad news for smaller players exactly?
Well, I mean, it's no secret, Justin. Like, shorter players have a harder time in this sport,
Sure.
and there's some stat that you can look up that every inch of height you have in your life, you're this much more likely to make the NBA. That's already established. But what I think is happening now in a world of Chet Holmgrens and Victor Wembanyama's, and LeBron James, by the way, is another fantastic example of this, who's American. If he grew up 20 years earlier, he would not be bringing the ball up the court. So I don't want to just say this is all Europeans. Magic Johnson was 6'9". LeBron James is 6'9". Like, these dudes were massive players that broke the mold of what a player of that size should be doing on a court too. So let me establish that. But in a world where post play is dead, Justin, we already talked about how nobody plays like that anymore. Well, if Tim Duncan were coming up now, he'd be dribbling up the top like Giannis or Embiid and facing up guys. In a world where they can initiate offense and pass, what is the role for a 6'3" player? If we start to see more and more of these players come into the NBA, what is the role? I mean, you already have to be a freakishly talented player if you're undersized. Kyrie Irving is the perfect example of this. Kyrie is just pound for pound the most skilled player in the league, in my opinion, on offense. He can what he can do is just dazzling. But when it comes to rebounding, protecting the basketball hoop, this next generation of playmakers that are also 6'8", 6'9", 6'10", 7'4". It's interesting to see. I wonder if there's going to be fewer smaller players if the skills are sort of democratized across the height chart of the NBA.
Yeah, it seems like you could see a scenario wherein, like, I don't know what the number is, but 10 to 20 years, there's a team that tries, all 5 of their starters 6'10" and above, or something along those
Yeah,
lines, just to see what it does, given what you just mentioned about if skills are similar, the extra space they can cover on the floor is just something that you can't really coach up or train up in a smaller high player, like 6'3" versus 6'10".
100%. Yeah, it's interesting. We call that the revenge of the girth in the book. Is there was a minute there in the 2010s, thanks to Draymond Green and Golden State's incredible offense and defense, where centers were kind of put up on trial and they had to adapt. Well, this is the adaptation, ladies and gentlemen, and they're evolved and they're back to they dominated the league for the first 50 years of its existence. I think centers won like 27 of the first 30 MVPs or something ridiculous like that. So it's not exactly a new concept, but the center domination was on hiatus for a minute. But I think in a world where the 6'10" guys can shoot threes and block shots and get rebounds, yeah, I think you're right, Matt. Is there a future 5-man lineup that's all 6'9" and above, and they can all dribble, pass, and shoot? I could totally see somebody trying that and just dominating. Maybe the Spurs will do it.
I'll let you go with this question. You mentioned earlier in the interview about the NBA has yet to move back to 3-point line. But yeah, we've seen them kind of experiment with different implementations of like the All-Star game or just certain aspects of All-Star weekend about, players shooting further back or even players just regularly shooting half court shots. So I ask you, how further back should they expand the 3-point line?
It's a good question. I think the corner three is the first thing to look at. I mean, that shot really shouldn't exist in the first place. Not to get too nerdy, but the arc is 23.75 feet, except on the baselines where it's 22 feet. We can all picture that straight line piece of the 3-point arc. It's 14 feet long from the baseline. And teams have been arbitraging that since Bruce Bowen increasingly. And they now represent 1 in 10 shots in the NBA corner threes, and they're worth about 1.2 points. And they just, an average mid-range shot is worth 0.8 points or 0.85 points. So it's just like, but that shot probably shouldn't exist in the first place. I'll say that the women's college 3-point line is 22.14 feet. Do you really think that, Malik Beasley should have the opportunity to shoot the same distance shot for 3 points in the NBA as the starting point guard for Yale women's college basketball? I think I have an answer for that. And no offense to Yale women's college basketball, I'm more of a Harvard guy, but they might be really good at shooting for all I know. I'm just saying, guys, every other league has moved it. So where, if you're asking me, we're either getting rid of the corner three, we're going to make a continuous 24-foot arc, and you're not going to have space to shoot those corner threes near the sidelines. But I would start at 24 or 25 feet. And I'm really looking at the corner three. I don't want to see 1 out of 10 shots when I go, put down a few $100 to see a game. I don't like watching Malik Beasley shoot corner threes. Call me crazy. I like watching Anthony Edwards slash to the rim, and I'd rather watch a guy shoot a fadeaway like Dirk. I think the corner three aesthetically is one of the most boring shots in the league. Analytically, I have to say it's one of the smartest shots in the league, without a doubt. And it's interesting. I think, guys, baseball confronted the same thing. The analytics might point you to the smarter game, but they might not point you to a prettier game. And baseball's had to fight this over the last 20 years. And I think basketball isn't far behind. So, yeah, let's get rid of the corner three. That's my hottest idea, Justin, and maybe move the line back a little bit.
This has been a fantastic chat. Thank you very, very much for joining us, Kirk. Can you please let our audience know where you can find you on social media, and then any other projects as well as where they can find Hoop Atlas?
Yeah, well, Hoop Atlas is available wherever books are sold. Amazon's the easiest, but support your local independent bookstores if you can. You can find me at Kirk Goldsberry on Instagram or on Twitter, now called X. And I appreciate you guys having me on. Thanks for the invite.
Likewise, thank you very much. Much appreciated.